Welcome to Planetary Systems Change with your host, Bjonnes. Welcome, James Quilligan, to our interview. James Quilligan is a political economist, and he has been an analyst and administrator in the field of international development since 1975. He has served as policy advisor and writer for many international politicians and leaders, including Pierre Trudeau, François Mitterrand, Edward Heath, Julius Nyerere, Olof Palme, Willy Brandt, Jimmy Carter, and His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan of Jordan. Quilligan was also a policy advisor and press secretary for the Brandt Commission from 1978 to 1984, and he's presently managing director of Economic Democracy Advocates, which we will talk a little bit about during the interview. And he has been an economic consultant for many government agencies in Mexico, Argentina, and a host of other countries, some 50 different countries over the years. So Mr. Quilligan has a long and distinguished career in politics and economics. So welcome, James. So the COVID-19 crisis has revealed some of the underlying problems with the market economy, such as high unemployment. Of course, unemployment has skyrocketed. However, the stock market is still going strong, as we have seen in earlier periods as well. So what is it about this economy? Is the crisis revealing underlying weaknesses, or is this a whole new economy that we're seeing? What is going on here?
Well, what's going on is business as usual. We're in a very unique place where neoliberalism is actually dying. Something is replacing it. The question is, what is it being replaced with? And global trade is declining as a result of COVID-19. It was already on the decline, but this has really put a death knell into global trade. Countries are beginning to become much more parochial, not letting trade in and not letting immigrants in, putting up walls around their nation's borders, unlike the last 50 years, 40 years that we've been witnessing open borders for trade and immigration and the flow of money across the world. So what's really happening is that we're putting up barriers now to become much more protectionist in a way that promotes nationalism. And so Wall Street likes this because at least in the short term, it's good for business. It's good for major businesses that are already established and are already monopolies, because what's happening is, of course, people need to use technology, and we're using it more than ever as a result of COVID-19. People need to shop for food. People need their necessities. And so the big companies that are already out there, Amazon and Walmart and you name it, Apple Computer, they're doing well. Zoom technology, doing very well. So it's driving a mini boom on Wall Street. But as people say, Wall Street is very disconnected from Main Street. And you go out to Main Street and you look and see that a lot of businesses are shut down, not only because of COVID-19, but also because of unemployment. They've had to lay off people. They're not selling products. There's a vicious cycle going on that has led to the recession that we're in. It's going to get worse. Projections are looking very dire for the next several years in the economy. So what's going on is we're in a transition period in which we really don't have all the answers. And as I began to say originally, this is a crisis of capitalism. We're into a point where the old solutions are not going to work. And even if we try to reform the economy or adjust the economy the way it is right now, we're not going to recover from this. So it's really important that people are educated in terms of what the real fundamentals are and what we need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that it's going to be difficult to recover from this, but the Democrats and also politicians in Europe are advocating deficit spending to dig ourselves out of the hole and out of this recession or perhaps even a depression. So to them, no debt is too large at this point because this crisis is so severe. So what about that? Can we just spend ourselves out of this problem?
That's a great question. This is really at the heart of a larger problem that affects both the political right and the political left. And let's just go back to the 1930s when John Maynard Keynes said that deficit spending was what the doctor ordered. This is what we really need to do. We need to be able to dig ourselves out of the depression by allowing government to come in and do deficit spending so that people could receive funds for doing civilian conservation corps and all the other programs from the New Deal, so that labor would be put back to work and they would have enough income to be able to buy the products that commerce was making on offer and not being able to sell. And as a result of that, the economy would recover. Well, that plus coupled with World War II, which was really a huge driver for the economy, really pulled us out of the Depression and made the United States into one of the richest countries in the history of the world. The richest country, actually, if you look at GDP, richer than the Roman Empire, really, in the 1950s and 60s. But what's going on here? So what Keynes said was deficit spending is good in bad times, but when times are good, governments have to get out of stimulating the economy. That's not what happened. What happened was the politicians who were in power at that time began to think that this is a really good deal for us as politicians, because if we can continue to do deficit spending, then and bring that money back to our local communities, then we're going to get voted into office again. So it's a very good deal because we're trading in pork, and the people are appreciating it. So what we had was institutionalized deficit spending and a whole culture which began to tell ourselves that deficits don't matter, that we can continue to roll over the debt ad infinitum and continue to borrow. Now, recently, or over the last 10, 15 years, a new theory has been put forward. And unfortunately, it's been taken up by people on the political left. And that new theory is along the lines, it's called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory basically reaffirms Keynes, but takes Keynes a step further. It says that the reason Keynesianism will work is not because of a temporary intervention in the economy. It's because people have not recognized the structure of the way monetary systems work. And you can go into a lot of details, but it's very simple. All they're saying is that on the budget side, we need to be able to budget to balance the debt that we're raising, the deficits we're using to be able to balance out with spending. And so, in other words, governments have a authorized ability and obligation to do deficit spending, and therefore that money can be created, which will be used to finance infrastructure and fight poverty and do the good things that are needed to be done. You know, a lot of people who are backing the Green New Deal now believe that modern monetary theory is the way to go. So the case that they're making is that institutionalized deficit spending, which was the legacy of Keynes, should continue, and we shouldn't be afraid of it because the United States has a long track record of doing this, and so have a number of other countries. So that and Europe has also picked it up, and you mentioned that U.S. politicians and politicians in Europe are promoting the idea of continued deficit spending. So what I'm getting at is that it's an old idea. It's been around for, since the 1930s. And it seemed to have worked then when we had 2 billion people in the world. We have now 8 million people. It worked when there was a smaller population. It worked when we didn't recognize that there was a crisis in non-renewable resources. It worked when in a time when there was not a lot of intercultural connection through the internet. And it worked when economies were not as global as they are now, when it was more bilateral trade going on between nations. So there were a lot of reasons why it worked in the 1930s, and then it hit a wall in the 1970s and began to flounder. But the problem is that it's being dusted off again as a leading edge to move ahead. So the third point I want to make here is that the reason this is not a good proposal is that what are we doing when we're borrowing? We say that we can borrow and there's no limit to our borrowing because we owe it to ourselves, and eventually we're going to pay it back. Well, that seems to imply that we owe it to ourselves and that we're going to be paying it back. But the fact is, for all the commodities that are listed on the asset basis of modern banks, if you look at that, you can say that those things have a commodity value, which gives value to the level of debt that is being accrued. But at the same time, that value has an ecological value. The value of those resources is really a mark of how much we're running up an ecological deficit along with an economic deficit. So I would suggest that modern monetary theory does not deal with this in the least. So we're not only borrowing resources from the future, we're borrowing resources from future generations. And particularly when it comes to non-renewable resources, we're making an utter mistake when we're claiming that deficits can go on forever because we owe it to ourselves. The fact is that we're running up an ecological deficit alongside the economic deficit, and then we're turning around, and people within Green New Deal are saying, no, the fact is you can use the economic deficit to pay for the ecological deficit. That's not true. The ecological deficit is the driving force behind the economic deficit, and this is what we haven't recognized since the 1930s. And this is the thing that disturbs me the most, probably, in terms of what's ahead for the global economy, because as long as we maintain that deficits don't matter, that we can continue to use the algorithms of the internet and projections into the future to say that growth is infinite, then we're going to follow that path and we're going to lead ourselves into great disaster, because our rational abilities are overweighing the intuition that we know that there's something wrong with the planet. And what is it that's wrong? We're creating inequality and we're creating ecological degradation because of the way the algorithms are set right now through a growth pattern of infinite growth. That's a big problem. Our minds and our hearts are not in sync, and it's going to create disaster.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, the Green New Deal may not be as green as people are thinking. As you mentioned, the proponent of the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Arundhati Roy, Yanis Varoufakis, and others are touting this as the solution to a global environmental crisis. But you're saying that to think that we can just spend ourselves out of it is not very green.
No, not at all. No, it's a way of saying that the market economy prevails, and we're just going to obey the laws of the market economy to pull ourselves out of the problem that the market economy created in the first place, which is the degreening of the planet, the loss of biodiversity, the spread of inequality. In developing countries, a lot of the developing countries were burning up the fossil fuels that were needed to, the wood and that was needed to develop. It's very wrong-headed. We're really saying is that the Green New Deal is necessary to save capitalism. We're not saying it's necessary to save the planet. I mean, that's really the implication of the Green New Deal. Who's going to pay for this? Well, we'll just raise the money by putting more people into debt and borrowing more from nature in the name of trying to save nature. Doesn't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. So another problem that you mentioned is inequality, of course. And Thomas Piketty, the best-selling French economist, has documented in great detail the growing economic inequality on the planet today. Now, his main remedy for that is higher taxation. In other words, tax the rich, tax the wealthy, tax the wealth, which is something that we did in the 50s and the 60s. At some point in the United States, taxes were up towards 80%, 90%. So do you think a progressive tax is the most effective way to solve inequality?
No, I think that's, again, another playbook from the past that I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough. It does not change the capitalist system, does not change the way it operates. The greater tax on the rich was part of the Keynesian solution, but it's not going to lead us into a real change in the structure of the way the economy works. It's just a reform within the economy. It's not going to change its structure. And that's what's needed. We need system change now. And Piketty he's put his finger on the problem that inequality is a structural part of the problem, but he's not changed the structure. He's just trying to reform it through that particular solution.
Mm-hmm. So, which points to the fact that there's a growing frustration with the capitalist market today. But economics is a complex subject. So I would like to get into some of the key issues of the capitalist economy. And you have talked about some of these in a talk that I attended. You mentioned that some of the basic issues of economics is what is called use value and exchange value. These are key components of the capitalist economy. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then and after that, talk about the third value, which seems to, in your words, sort of balance these two values, use value and exchange value, which is distributive value. And I'm hoping that maybe through this we can get to the heart of some of the fundamental problems with capitalism.
Yeah, thanks. Use value and exchange value were identified by Adam Smith. So this is right in the wheelhouse of classical economics. But he discovered them in the works of Aristotle. So the idea goes really back anciently, and I'm sure Aristotle picked this up from somebody too. basically Aristotle was saying, and Adam Smith later repeated this, that there's two basic kinds of value, that it's really helpful to make this distinction. Then we can understand what's going on with buying and selling, and how we identify the meaning of a kind of local market and how it operates. So use value is very easy to understand. Use value is the things that you have at home that are useful to you, that have utility. And the other kinds of commons, like public places and goods and services that you use and appreciate, they enhance our experience, and they satisfy a personal function or need. And so they're said to have use value. And they're also associated with freedom, because we use things to express our free will and self-determination. As opposed to that, there's something else called exchange value. So when you have something that's useful to you and you put it on the market, then the use value changes into an exchange value that is usually expressed through its price. There are some exceptions to that, but because there are different components into what constitutes price. But putting that aside, generally speaking, exchange value is expressed through the price of something. So rather than just having something of use in your house that you don't think about in terms of its price, all of a sudden, when you create something and you put it in the marketplace, it's seen as having an exchange value. And we're all familiar with that. We go into the supermarket and we shop, and we think of what we want to buy in terms of its use value, and then we look at the price of it and say, that's the exchange value. Can I afford that? So it's not really difficult to understand. So it's the basic premise of how buying and selling takes place in the modern economy. The problem with the exchange value, though, is that it's been used as a determinant of equality. And it's kind of a strange argument that is made, because what people say is that because prices that are offered for products are the same for everybody, they're equalized in their availability on a trading platform within the marketplace. So therefore, the market economy generates an equality in individual purchasing capacity, because we have a lot of different products from which to choose. So that doesn't make much sense, because if equality really means equal protection, equal treatment, or equal access to the same resources and services as other people, then exchange value actually creates the opposite condition than equality. Exchange value is a means by which people can seek a return on investment, seek economic growth and profit, and also hoard what they have accumulated in their wealth. So exchange value turns into a kind of a proposition that is misleading for people. But in history, what's happened is use value has taken hold in some cultures because use value promotes small businesses. In our culture, use value has morphed into big businesses, so that we have small and big businesses, and the big businesses now are the ones who are promoting exchange value. So it's really a mix of the two things. And what we do in talking about use value and exchange value is getting back to the real fundamentals. Use value really does have a place in local economies by creating the basis of small businesses, not the conglomerates and monopolies that we're used to. And exchange value has some basis in which to understand the nature of why purchasing capacity is a very important concept. But together, use value and exchange value over history have created a monopoly between the market and the state, where the market supports use value and the state creates exchange value or supports exchange value. That dichotomy has crippled us. And the reason that there needs to be some kind of new solution is that without a new kind of principle to move beyond freedom and equality, we're really stuck, because the two forces of the market and the state are fighting against each other. And they're making us believe that they're the only game in town, that there is no other alternative from the market or the state. So, and also in virtually all societies in history, cooperation has been treated as an aspect of equality rather than a distinct principle of social value. But what I'm suggesting is that cooperation needs to be seen as just as important as freedom and equality. Cooperation needs to be seen as a distinct principle. And so in doing so, cooperation, we think about it in terms of cooperatives, which really go back in time. They're organized groups that come together for mutual benefit. So we think of tribal cultures that work together to hunt and gather food and build homes and fend off enemies. And we also recognize that within our own bodies, there's cooperation. Every cell in our body relies on cooperation from the other cells and organs and systems. And cooperation is apparent in nature right down to the molecular level. So that principle needs to be present in society, particularly if we're trying to solve the ecological crisis and make the economy much more like an ecosystem. So to that end, it's really irrelevant how useful a product is in terms of use value, or what the price sells for in terms of exchange value, unless we measure the extent to which it reaches the population that needs it. Because as we know in ecosystems, the amount of resources in an area that need to be recycled to meet the needs of the population in that area is known as the distributed value of those resources. We need to be able to apply the term distributed value to our economies and take it out of just the ecosystems and look at what it means in terms of bringing a new principle to bear in the modern economy. And so it shows that cooperation is necessary for system change, and that we're familiar with worker and consumer cooperatives, but we need to really focus in the future more on the resources that are going to be distributed to people to meet their needs. So we've never had, except on very small scales, we've never had an economy that has been based in distributed value to meet the needs of people. We're aware of cooperatives in a lot of areas: housing, in the arts, and finance, and environment, agriculture, manufacturing. There are lots of kinds of cooperatives, but we're focused mostly on the worker or consumer cooperatives. Today, it's important to focus on distributive cooperatives so that we have a chance now to model the economy according to what an ecosystem looks like. And in ecosystems, once a need is identified and measured, it's automatically met in a functioning ecosystem. That's what we need to be able to do in the modern economy. And that, there's a lot in what I just said, but that is the basic principle of how to create system change in terms of the polarization right now between use value and exchange value.
Mm-hmm. So you have talked a lot about the relationship between economics and ecology. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because this seems to be an essential relationship. Without an ecology, without nature, we don't have an economy. And we are right now in an economic crisis, and we are in an ecological crisis. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship and the importance of that relationship in economics?
Right. Well, earlier I was saying that, you know, the Green New Deal is doomed if it's going to rely on raising money through deficit spending,
Right.
because, you know, and it touches on what you have just said, that it's exactly the backwards way of trying to solve the environmental crisis. We need to be able to actually incorporate ecology into our system of trade and finance and monetary policy. We're nowhere near that, because virtually all the policies that have come forward, and I, as a specialist in this, I see this stuff, you know, every day I see new ideas, but 99.9% of what I see says that, yeah, we can solve the ecological crisis through the market system, and here's how we do it. So you know, there are technological solutions for that, and there are solutions about educating people through that, and to reorganize the market economy through corporate initiatives to build out greener companies, and they all boil down to the same thing. We're still intending to use the market economy to spend our way out of the problem. And the market economy, as you know, at the moment relies primarily on fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are creating the source of carbon dioxide, which is actually creating climate change, and also biodiversity loss. And we're not going to get very far down the road by continuing to say that it's the market value of things that has to drive or provide the incentives to create these solutions. The problem is we're going to have to take a completely different approach. And the approach is not so much the way the market wants to see growth. It's to be able to model the rate of growth that we have in terms of what drives the economy, to identify the rate of growth that takes place in biology. So the growth rates, rather than being abstract rates that we want to see driving the economy, have to be developed on the principle that nature only replenishes itself at a certain rate. So the regeneration rate of nature needs to be incorporated into the understanding of how fast the economy can advance. And that means that we're going to need to be able to scale back our growth. It doesn't mean degrowth. It doesn't mean that we should abolish all concept of growth. The fact is that there does need to be some development, you know, just as bodies grow and you know, markets have to grow at some level. But what it does mean is that we need to scale back our growth considerably to get in to the carrying capacity of our environment. So if the carrying capacity shows us the rates at which resources produced in our environment meet the needs of the population and the environment, that's exactly the principle that needs to be applied in terms of the market. The market needs to do that. Now, the other thing is that the market ideologues believe that that's what the supply and demand is doing. But supply and demand are proxies for an ecosystem. You know, supply purports to mobilize the resources available in an ecosystem and then deliver it to the demand of the organisms in the ecosystem. Well, that's not exactly how an ecosystem works. I mean, that's sort of the way the markets propose that it works, but it doesn't actually work that way. So on the supply side, we're actually utilizing resources which are breaching the planetary limits for non-renewable resources. We're calling that supply and not worrying about the limits to planetary resources, just how much the supply is worth. And then measuring demand, we're measuring in terms of how much money a person has rather than what their needs are. And demand and need don't correlate. They're not the same thing at all. They overlap in some areas, but demand is just a measure of how much money you have to buy something. So, so the market wants to create proxies for what takes place in an ecosystem, but it's way off base, and we've got to fine tune that again. And it's more than just reforming it; it's actually restructuring the way it works.
Yeah, wonderful. So that leads up to my next question, which is the work that you are actually doing, which is, you mentioned carrying capacity. You're working with an organization called Economic Democracy Advocates, or EDA. You're the managing director. And one of the things that you have done through EDA is working on carrying capacity, developing, analyzing the carrying capacity of local economies. So another, and of course, economic democracy. So wondering if you could talk a little bit about both of these issues, but in particular, economic democracy. We have political democracy to some extent, we could say, but more and more people are realizing that what is really important for people is economic democracy, economic determination, purchasing capacity, but even more so, democracy in terms of resources and the local economy. So can you talk about that? What does that mean?
A lot of different aspects to this. So it seems to me that an economy, once it identifies that it needs to restructure the way use value and exchange value work, and to institute a principle of distributed value so that when a need arises, it's automatically met. And just as it happens in an ecosystem. How do we do that? Well, once distributed value is created, then we need to be able to recognize that in a broader way, we need to develop a culture around that. So take the local economy, for example. Our ancestors built their economies not only around their resources, and particularly their watersheds, so that they had access to rivers, not only for transportation, but also for water to supply them with the crops that they were growing. But those economies also developed cultures. So cultures are important. Education is important to recognize how to redistribute resources to the within the economy, and why that's important. Why it's important to recognize that we live in commons. We don't live in areas that are actually private or public sector. Those are terms that are man-made terms. We've imposed those terms on the built environment that we have. The fact is that all of the resources that are out there are owned by everybody. And as I said earlier, you can have a claim to a small portion of that, and if it's very good that takes place, but that's gotten out of hand. Scaling it back to the local economy means then you have to be able to recognize that people need to be not only educated in this, but educated into why they need to get more active in decision-making for self-sufficient resource management. Very important, because if we outsource our decision-making to the government or to the markets, then we're losing our commons, because they're the ones who are saying that we're not bright enough to manage these resources for ourselves. It has to be done only by professionals who know what they're doing. And so they created huge industries around government management of resources and private management of resources. And it's displaced people to a great extent. It's created all kinds of problems. We need to be able to recapture our own management of resources. One of the ways we can do that is through technology. The internet is a prime source of it. When the internet was launched in the 1880s and the 1980s and 1990s, we were talking about the great prospect of the internet to be able to help to distribute resources. It never happened. I mean, you have Amazon, but it's all privatized. We thought that there would be much more of a egalitarian distribution of resources through the internet. There are some places on the internet that offer that kind of service through open source networks, but by and large, Facebook is not that platform, and most of the social media that you know is not that platform. So, but technology still is a key to be able to make this happen. For example, the media that we're working on right now is a good example of it. There are still ways of utilizing this media for more progressive purposes. And then, all of this leads up to the fact that self-sufficient resource management needs not only the participation, it needs the expertise to be able to analyze carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is this area that needs to be able to supplant supply and demand in a way. Because what we're talking about is the actual measurement of the resources in an area to meet the needs of its population. That's what carrying capacity does for an ecosystem. It is the same kind of thing that is taking place in banking, and the same kind of thing that the market is aspiring to, which is not being done. It's the same kind of formulation. The idea is that you have supply and the demand needs to be able to meet the supply. The fact is that what's happened in the classical economics is that people began to recognize the differences between supply and demand, and then say, well, the theory now, the emphasis we're going to put on it is that supply creates its own demand. So we don't need to worry about the demand. And so by doing that, you delegate the demand to something that nobody needs to pay any attention to. And not to mention the fact that supply is not a measure of human needs, but supply and demand don't work largely because the overemphasis on supply is one of the driving factors of inequality. If the demand is not going to meet the supply, and the people who are producing the supply don't really care about the demand only in times of recession or depression, then they're not going to be able to create the social policies to be able to lift people up and create more purchasing capacity on the part of the people who will be the demand side, the people who are going to be raising the cash to be able to buy the products that are being sold by the suppliers. So in light of that, then, the last thing I would say about that is that all of this together needs to get into a kind of framework of sustainable unity, bringing ecology and economy and government together in a way that sees sustainability not only as something that's ecological, but sustainable governments that we can trust to carry forward policies. When the people are voted out of office, we can expect some stability in our government, and sustainable cultures, and also sustainable economies. Why do we have this swing of booms and busts in the economy? We need to be able to stabilize that, make it much more sustainable than it is. If we were able to bring the ecological principles into the economy, we would have much smoother sailing because it would be far more sustainable. So those are some of the elements that go into creating economic democracy that are very important. And lastly, I would just emphasize the importance of having democratic decision making, because at the moment, we have representative democracy, which is really not working because the lobbyists from the corporations are coming in and telling the politicians what they want. And they're listening to the politicians more than to the people. If people began to manage their own resources on a local basis or regional basis through participatory decision-making, then we'd be in a much greater position to influence the way that our resources are produced and distributed. And that is really key to our future, because at the moment, we're outsourcing all those decisions to other people to make on our behalf, and it's not working. You know, just a key example is the way Nestle Corporation will come into a local area and for a small price, convince the city council to lease them the property on which the aquifers are accessible. And in so doing, Nestle pumps out all this water at a very cheap rate, takes it back and bottles it in their factories, and then brings it back, trucks it back into the local area and sells it to the people. It's their water, and now they have to pay for it because a corporation got involved in the middle of it. It's a good example, but there are many other examples like it. And that points to the fact that corporations like to come into an area and take the resources and also use cheap labor in that area, and then take the profits out and never invest it back into the communities again. And so this hollows out cities and towns and regions, and it creates a situation in which we're all facing the problems of resource scarcity and the lack of sustainability in our areas, because we're not measuring the right things. We're measuring the use value and exchange value of commodities, but we're not measuring them, their distributed value, and certainly not their sustainable value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this leads to another question about restructuring and economics. You've talked a little bit about that. One of the thinkers that has presented a new restructured economy, to put it that way, is Pierre Sarkar and his Prout economic system. And I know that you've studied Sarkar, and also in your work with EDA, you're using some of his ideas. So can you talk a little bit about Prout? What does Prout mean? What is the difference between a Prout economy and a capitalist economy?
Prout economy does something very important, and they distinguish between cooperatives and small businesses, community-run small businesses that have a private incentive, and then cooperatives that have a more public incentive, and then government-run industries which work to provide public services to the people in the community. These things sound somewhat similar, and in a way, in the present market economy, they're all thrown into the same, all lumped together, but they're very unique, and they also express different principles of economics in different ways. So that's why they're all three very important directions in which society needs to move. It seemed to me when I began to study Prout that those were the three different directions in which society needed to begin to evolve, which is that use value would be the building out of small businesses. Individual incentive is really important, and it's an expression of freedom. The local government-run public services, meaning supply chains and public utilities, have a very important function in the community to do what small businesses can't do and cooperatives can't do, which is to manage water supply or food supply on a basis in which, or electric, for example, on a basis in which the smaller businesses can't be able to do that. And then lastly, cooperatives themselves. Cooperatives are extremely important in not only in developing and distributing resources, but also in incorporating the idea of participatory democracy within society, because it's through cooperatives that people are going to get used to the idea of making collaborative decisions. And by their nature, they are cooperatives. It's the principle that's missing in society. So you have the freedom of small businesses, you have the equality expressed through these government-run utilities on the behalf of the communities. And then you have cooperation, which is really embodied by the cooperatives. Cooperatives are extremely important for leading to the dimension that I was mentioning about distributed value, because they're the closest thing that we have in economics that would replicate the way an ecosystem operates, which is very important.
Right. And so, so in other words, this type of an economy would be mirroring the ecosystem much better than any kind of reformed capitalism, whether you call it green or socialist. Is that?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, you know that here at Future Planet, one of our main themes is systems change, which is, you know, the title for this podcast as well. When I mention the term systems change, what does that mean to you? What is economic, environmental, political systems change? What comes to mind?
Well, the first thing is that we need to be not pointing people towards system change. We need to be actively demonstrating system change, because as long as it's a concept, it doesn't get off the ground. But so that means, you know, walking the talk. We need to be able to build cooperatives that embody the spirit of cooperation in ways that will begin to create models for how to change the present economic system. I think we're going to get help in this direction because the market system is failing, and people are going to be increasingly looking for answers to these problems. But you know, just getting back into why system change is so important is that it's such a vast topic. But you know, number one, we're so used to the economy that we've grown up in that we can't think outside the box. We just, that's why I was saying earlier that all the solutions for green ideas keep coming back to the marketplace. And it's so wrong-headed, you know, you can't create solutions to problems that are based in the, you know, the very reasons why the problems emerged in the first place. It doesn't work. It's all backwards. And that's what's happening. And that's, you know, that's why system change is the only thing that can really bring us out of that. So, you know, I think there are leverage points for system change that are really important for people to understand, because it's not just a concept. It's, we've got to be able to take the different elements that we know will work to be able to create a whole package of the different elements of system change to be able to get this off the ground. And I've mentioned a few of those. I think that we need to honor use value and exchange value as important principles from the past, but to redefine them. Distributed value is absolutely critical for the future. Distributed value is something that I think economists have been fishing around for a long time. And it's always been present right before our nose, because that's what ecosystems expresses is distributed value along the lines of carrying capacity, as I was saying. We need to build out culture to support this. Another key aspect of system change. We need to be able to create our educational system around all of these topics. We need to be able to address the capacities of technology to maintain the social complexity we have right now, but not through market-driven solutions like you see through Facebook or through the other technology platforms. We need to be able to apply it to the cooperative systems that we've been discussing. And then, the self reliance that needs to be generated through the participatory decision-making in the management of our resources. And then the unity that creates through sustainability in the areas of politics and economics, as well as ecology. Those are key leverage points, and there are programs and things that can be done in all of those different areas. So it really is a big paradigm shift. It's enormous. It's something that we're going to have to get used to, and we're going to have to begin to develop very, very soon. A lot of people are saying we're not going to make it through the 2020s without major change. And, the more we can get people familiar with the concept of systems change and begin to define exactly what that means in terms of all these leverage points, then I think we'll get somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, James. Wonderful for this wonderful interview. This has been Planetary Systems Change with your host, Bjonnes, and we have been talking with political economist James Quilligan. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you come back to our next episode.